The sun hammered down on the dry, yellowed grass of the hillside. There was no shade. Thousands of people sat in long, jagged rows, their heads bowed against the relentless glare. Dust coated their skin, and their eyes were hollowed by days of travel. A heavy, suffocating silence hung over the slope, broken only by the occasional dry rasp of a throat or the shifting of tired limbs. Hunger was no longer a sharp pain. It had settled into a dull, constant ache that drained the life from the air. Jesus stood at the center of the gathering, his gaze sweeping across the sea of slumped shoulders and vacant faces. He turned to the men beside him. "They have nothing left to eat," he said. The disciples moved through the outer edges of the crowd, their hands empty. They scanned the horizon, searching for any sign of a market, but the landscape remained barren. They checked their own satchels, finding only dust and lint. The reality of the situation took hold. A few yards away from the main group, a young boy sat tucked into a patch of withered shade. His knuckles were white where he gripped the woven handles of a small bag. Inside, the contents shifted with a soft, dry rustle. 5 barley loaves and 2 dried fish. He could feel the shape of the bread against his palm. He looked up and saw the disciples returning from their search. They walked slowly, their shoulders slumped, shaking their heads as they met the eyes of those waiting. One disciple kicked at the dirt, his face tight with frustration. Another checked his empty satchel one last time, turning it inside out to show nothing remained. The boy pulled the bag closer to his chest, shielding it from view. He looked at the thousands of people around him, then back at the small, meager meal in his lap. The contrast was absolute. He was one person with a handful of food, and the hillside was filled with a sea of people whose hands were completely empty. He felt the heat radiating off the ground, the dry wind pulling at his hair, and the growing tension of the crowd. He knew what he had, and he knew what they needed. The boy pushed himself up from the ground. His legs felt like lead, trembling under the strain of standing. He took one step, then another, his feet sinking into the loose, dry soil of the hillside. He kept his eyes fixed on the center of the clearing where the figure sat. As he navigated through the rows of people, he tripped over an exposed root, his shoulder slamming into a man sitting nearby. He gasped, his grip tightening on the woven bag, until his fingers ached. He regained his balance, heart hammering against his ribs, and pushed forward again. The crowd seemed to shrink away, creating a narrow path that led directly to the circle. He could feel the heat rising from the earth. He reached the edge of the circle and stopped. The space was quiet, save for the wind whistling through the dry grass. The boy knelt, his hands shaking. He extended his arms, holding the meager meal out. "This is all I have," he whispered. Jesus reached out. His fingers closed around the rough fabric of the bag, lifting it away from the boy's reach. The movement was slow, deliberate, and entirely calm. He did not glance at the contents. He did not measure the bread or the fish against the thousands waiting on the slope. Instead, he turned his gaze upward, toward the vast, cloudless expanse of the sky. He raised the bag high, his arms extending fully, his posture rigid and unwavering. As he lifted the offering, the wind that had been whipping across the hillside suddenly died. The restless shifting of the crowd ceased. Thousands of people froze, their eyes locked on the small, woven container held against the light. A profound, heavy silence descended, pressing down on the hillside like a physical weight. Jesus began to speak. His voice was not loud, yet it carried across the parched grass. He spoke a blessing, the words rhythmic and steady. The boy remained on his knees, watching the lines of the man's face. The blessing ended. The silence shattered as the disciples moved forward, reaching into the baskets to begin the distribution. The boy stayed on his knees, his eyes fixed on the hands of the man nearest to him. He watched the disciple reach into the woven container, pull out a piece of bread, and hand it to a woman in the front row. The disciple turned back, reached in again, and pulled out another piece. The basket did not tilt. It did not lighten. It remained heavy, anchored to the ground by the weight of the contents. The boy shifted his gaze to a second disciple. He saw a man break a dried fish in half, the fibers parting with a sharp snap, yet the pile beneath it stayed exactly as it had been. The disciple reached down a third time, a fourth, and the basket remained full to the brim. The boy blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the reality did not change. He watched a man take a piece of bread, then another, yet the supply seemed to draw from an invisible source. The baskets remained heavy, defying the laws of gravity. He stood up, his legs finally steady, and took a step toward the nearest basket. He looked inside. The bread and fish were still there, stacked as if they had never been touched. The boy did not wait for an invitation. He lunged forward, grabbing the handle of a nearby basket that the disciples had set down. It was heavy, the weight pulling his arm downward, but he did not falter. He ran toward the edge of the crowd, where the people were most desperate. He reached into the basket, pulled out a handful of bread, and pressed it into the hands of a man who had been slumped against the grass. The man looked at the food, then at the boy, his fingers trembling as he took a bite. The boy moved on, weaving through the rows of people. He handed out portions to children who had been too weak to stand. He watched as they chewed, their eyes widening, their faces shifting from hollow exhaustion to sudden, vibrant life. Laughter began to ripple through the hillside, a low sound that grew into a chorus of disbelief. People were pointing at the baskets, then at each other. The boy felt the basket in his hand. It remained as full as when he had started. He ran faster, darting between groups, his feet kicking up dust as he distributed the bread and fish. Everywhere he turned, the silence of hunger was being replaced by the sounds of a great feast. The crowd was no longer a sea of misery. They were eating and talking. The frantic pace of the feast began to wane. The sounds of chewing softened into satisfied murmurs as the thousands finally leaned back against the grass, their hunger fully extinguished. The boy stopped his running, his chest heaving, and looked across the hillside. The disciples were moving through the rows again, but this time, they were not handing out food. They were gathering. One by one, they returned to the center where Jesus sat, each carrying a woven container. The boy watched as they set them down in a circle. He counted them. 1, then 2, then 5, until 12 baskets stood in a ring, each one overflowing with the remnants of the bread and fish. The crowd went quiet. They stared at the piles of food, their expressions shifting from the joy of the meal to a deep, heavy awe. The boy walked toward the center, his own hands empty, his skin coated in the dust of the hillside. He stood before the 12 baskets, unable to look away. The air felt charged, the silence now thick with the realization of what had occurred. The sun began to sink, casting long, golden shadows over the impossible bounty. The boy stood frozen, his gaze shifting from the overflowing baskets to his own palms. They were empty, marked only by the dust of the long day. He flexed his fingers, the skin dry and cracked, and looked up at the sky, then back at the circle of leftovers. The weight of what had happened settled into his bones. He had arrived with so little, a bag that felt light against his side. And now, the hillside was a testament to a shift he could barely comprehend. He felt a presence move beside him. The grass crunched underfoot as Jesus stepped into the space between the baskets. The boy did not move, his breath catching in his throat. He felt a firm, warm weight settle onto his shoulder. He turned his head slightly, meeting the gaze of the man who had taken his small offering. Jesus simply held his gaze and gave a slow, deliberate nod. He looked down at his hands once more, then back at the baskets, finally understanding the truth of the day. The sacrifice had been small, but the result was vast. The crowd began to drift away, their movements slow and deliberate. They walked down the slope in small groups, their voices fading into the distance until only the soft sound of wind remained. The boy watched them go, his eyes tracking the last figures as they vanished into the deepening twilight. The orange glow on the horizon bled into a soft, bruised purple, and the first stars began to prick through the darkening sky. He turned back to the center of the hillside. The 12 baskets remained, sitting in the grass like silent sentinels of the day. The boy walked around the circle, touching the woven edges of the containers. They were still heavy, still full, a physical impossibility that now felt like a natural part of the world. He sat down on the cooling earth, his legs finally resting. The silence was absolute. There was no more hunger, no more urgency, only the steady rhythm of his own breathing and the vast, quiet expanse of the hill. He looked at his hands, open and relaxed in his lap. He realized that the weight he had carried earlier was gone, replaced by a profound sense of clarity. He had given what he had, and in return, he had witnessed the impossible. The hillside, once a place of desperate need, was now a place of stillness. He stayed there as the shadows stretched long and thin, watching the world settle into the night. He stood up, left the baskets where they lay, and began the long walk home, carrying the quiet peace of the hillside within him.